The Canadian real estate market has undeniably changed. The days of super low interest rates are gone. The days of no conditions on buying a home are gone. And we need to adapt to this new market. Today, I speak with my longtime friend, Andrew Wells. He's been in the real estate business for the last 20 years, serving people like us as a real estate agent. Today, he gives us an understanding of the market conditions and the dynamics, but perhaps more importantly, he gives us tips. Tips for a seller to apply, and tips for a buyer to use as well. Have a listen to a great conversation I had with Andrew Wells. Andrew, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. You once told me that people in Toronto talk about two things: the weather
and
real estate.
And it's still true today.
And we're not going to talk about
We're not talking about the weather.
We're not talking about the
let's
weather.
not talk about the weather.
Over the last few years, call it 2 or 3 years, things have changed.
Indeed.
We were once in a world of basically 0% interest rates, where mortgages were 1.5%, and now we're in a world where they are
Much more expensive.
much more expensive.
From free money to very expensive money.
Expensive money. And this has massive implications for real estate. And I just wanted to get a sense today of two things. One, kind of where we are, what's going on out there. And then if the rules have changed, the approaches have changed, let's get the folks, the listeners, some concrete things that they can do to better serve themselves in this market. So bring us up to speed on where we are.
Sounds great. So obviously, last few years we've had a few different shocks have come through the real estate system in Canada. COVID led to the Bank of Canada positioning itself with a very low interest rate environment. That led to a whole bunch of people going out, and as their lives shifted, they started doing work from home, working remote. A lot of people moved around, and when they went shopping, they were shopping with those very low interest rates. Well, because they had easy access to capital, it created an inflationary situation where the average price of properties went up by about 30 to 35%, depending on the market.
In a year or 2 years?
Yeah, that was in 12 to 18 months.
Okay.
The market really lifted from spring of 2021. It peaked out in March of 2022. And at that point, the Bank of Canada had up until that point said, we're going to keep interest rates very low. And then they suddenly turned around and said, oh, actually, inflation is now a huge problem. We're going to take interest rates to a place where they haven't been in 20 years. So the net effect on that, in terms of just kind of breaking it down, back in March of 2021, if you wanted to borrow $100,000, it would cost you about $320 a month. Okay. Today, in fall of 2023, to borrow $100,000 is going to cost you $640 a month. It has doubled. So the carrying cost to the consumer to go out and buy a purchase, it's so much more expensive. I was recently talking with a colleague of mine, and he said, the impact of this is hitting me in ways I couldn't have discerned before. We've been talking about inflation and how it's having this impact on everything, such as, say, your groceries. And my colleague, he's really put it, I think, best. He said, I'm not so concerned about the average price of an avocado going up 60 cents. I'm concerned because I'm looking at my mortgage going up $4,000 a month. And that's where we are today. So we're now in a totally new situation where the cost of borrowing capital for Canadians to get into that property has gone up dramatically, and suddenly a lot of people are actually finding out that maybe they can't afford to carry their properties. You got to live somewhere. You got to make sure you can afford the roof over your home or over your head, and we're now in a situation where Canadians are readjusting and having to find out how are you going to move forward in a very different interest rate environment where you still have requirements related to your property needs.
So
we're going to talk about some of this
downward pressure on prices because somebody who used to be able to afford a $1 million house can no longer.
Correct.
Maybe their budget is now $700,000.
Yeah.
And then there's the person who got into a $1 million mortgage 3 years ago, which is staring that calendar in the face going,
every month it's burning and it's getting more expensive.
Yes. So that's where we are. Has there been different pockets that have reacted differently to this change in interest rates?
Very much so. So when the pandemic first hit, in Toronto specifically, 50,000 people upped and left. And everybody moved into the burbs. A lot of people moved up to, say, Collingwood or Haliburton or Muskoka, and they're thinking, I'm just going to adapt and I'm going to now live in a remote work environment. Fast forward 3 years later, that's now changing. People are feeling that, oh, there's stress on me to come back down to the office. I need to reintegrate. I want to be back in a more urban setting. And as a result, we're starting to see all of this inventory in the outer reaches. It's all hitting the market at the same time. A lot of people, they also bought secondary properties because it was cheaper to get into them. Suddenly the carrying costs on those are going up. And we're seeing this surplus of inventory starting to arrive. And what's happening? It's commodifying the market. So if there's too much product and not enough purchasers, all things being equal, the only difference is price, and it's starting to bring the prices down. So we're now leaning into what are called buyer's market conditions. So we have, again, a surplus of properties, lack of buyers, and that means it's better for the buyers. For the few buyers who are out there, they're finding that they've got much more selection, they've got the opportunity, they can negotiate, they can also do better due diligence, and they can bring in conditions for their purchases.
So just to go back to the regions that kind of went up, doubled or went up by 40% during COVID because everybody wanted a pool or a lake or a nice view in the backyard. Are those the areas that are suffering the...
It's starting in
there.
Recreational properties are at the top of the charts because if people, they're going to pay for their primary residence first, and if they had a secondary property and that's becoming a burden, they're going to start to let go of that. We're now starting to see it's actually coming from sort of those outer regions. It's now getting closer to the GTA. Places like Oshawa, before the pandemic hit, you could still buy a detached home in Oshawa for between $250,000 to $300,000.
Before pandemic?
Before the pandemic.
Okay.
Once we were into the heart of the pandemic, once we were into the fall of 2021, spring of 2022, those same houses were selling for $800,000. Well, here we are a year and a half later, and suddenly none of that product is moving. And we are starting to see values are coming back down. Within Toronto specifically, we've been seeing prices have been falling by 1% to 3% for about 4 months now. We did have a bit of lift in the early half of 2023. That all stopped because the Bank of Canada started raising interest rates again after May. And then further outside, we're seeing more pressure areas like Hamilton, which saw a lot of growth, Oshawa, Orangeville, some of these suburban areas where we don't have the income to support the valuations that were being put on the table at that time.
With the new interest rates.
Yeah.
Got it.
We're also seeing when the interest rates went very low, a lot of people felt very empowered to say, I've done well with my real estate. I feel like I've got a lot of equity. They ported equity out of their existing properties. They went and they bought investment properties. And now those are becoming a bit of a challenge because they're finding that they don't have the carrying capacity. The cash flow that those properties can attract no longer lines up with what the market will bear relative to the carrying cost. So you're seeing a lot of investors suddenly feeling a lot of pressure saying, oh, suddenly my rents are nowhere near to covering the cost for this. Maybe I need to divest.
So there's a lot of different actors who are struggling or soon will be struggling.
Yeah.
Prices down. I don't want to blame everything completely on the pandemic because before then there still was a time where you would walk into a house that you were thinking about buying, you tour it, you go outside and go, yeah, let's put an offer on it.
Yeah.
And you couldn't even remember how many washrooms it had.
Because that sounds like somebody I know that happened to. But yes, we were, before the pandemic happened, we were already leaning into a burning market. Back in spring of 2020, there was lots of people out there trying to buy, not much inventory. It was very common to see multiple offers, to see bidding wars and competition. When the pandemic hit, we briefly closed the market for about 4 months just because everybody was locked at home.
Yeah.
But as soon as they came back out, because the Bank of Canada had lowered interest rates, we still had just as many people looking to buy, and just they had suddenly a lot more access to capital, and then they all had to compete with it. So it had this net effect of creating this sort of this push up in prices, and we're now starting to see some of that is coming back out of the system.
So what I'm hearing, bottom line, is before it was a seller's market.
Yes.
And today it is a buyer's market.
Correct.
And in the seller's market, you're buying a house and you don't know how many washrooms are in it. You're just there's no
conditions, no negotiations.
Like you're doing them a favor by giving them
you're trying to
millions of dollars.
You're doing your best foot forward to say, pick me because you're competing with 10 or 15 other people. We are now in
there
totally the opposite.
There were people writing letters.
Oh yes,
selling their family
with pictures.
With pictures.
With pictures. Yeah.
So today, being in a buyer's market, bring us up to speed on what that means and what people should expect and what they should, as a buyer, like demand.
Yeah.
Almost these days, because you're in that pole position.
So this is actually a much better time to buy a property, and it allows you to both have some time for consideration. I would say the theme, actually, of this whole conversation is be patient. If you're on the purchasing side, be patient, do your due diligence. You have the opportunity, you can get your financing in place. You will make an offer now. It's conditional on sending your financing through to your lending institution. They're going to review it. They may ask for an appraisal, make sure that the property appraises. You want to make sure that if you need to sell your property, you may want to have a condition which is called conditional on sale of a purchaser's property. So if you're not able to sell your property, you can exit the deal of the place that you're buying. We haven't seen that kind of a condition available for about 4 or 5 years. So these are good things, I believe.
Yes.
Because from a consumer standpoint, it means that you actually have the opportunity to do your due diligence, make sure that you're safely moving forward, and that if there's a problem in the transaction, you can safely exit it without it having really disastrous consequence if you can't, say, close. So you just need to be mindful that these are different market conditions and you're going to operate differently. It's much more challenging to get your financing and funding done. You can't just take it as a given that either the property will appraise or that your approval will be actually pushed right through. A lot of people, they mistake that you can have a pre-approval from a lender, but that's not the same as having an underwritten approval coming out of the underwriting department. It's important that you get that piece of paper that says you are approved.
Tell me about a story or two around as the property is about to close, person thinks that they've got their mortgage all lined up, and then
suddenly, oh hey, great situation. A lot of properties, this specific was in 2022 we saw this, there was a lot of properties transacted in the first quarter of that year, and they sold for premium prices, and they had longer closing periods of like 6-7 months. Well, in that intervening time, the average property price dropped by anywhere from 10 to 15%. And the bank said, well, we're going to go back, reappraise the house, and suddenly the banks are saying, we're only going to lend 80% to loan to value. So even though you may have qualified, they're going to say, well, if the property doesn't meet our lending criteria, you're responsible to come up with the difference. So people found out all of a sudden they couldn't get the loans that they thought they had, which led to a lot of weeks before or days before. And suddenly they're scrambling, trying to find excess capital that they can't easily get their hands on. In some cases, deals broke and end up in lawsuits, and you don't want to be in that position. Just to give you an understanding, if you make a purchase on a property and you don't close, and that property sells for a lesser amount down the road, you're liable for the difference.
Yes.
This is happening right now with some builder sales, where people bought properties 2-3 years ago, they're now completing, and those properties aren't appraising, so people can't get loans to complete and close on their own new purchases. So what's happening is the builder's saying, well, we're going to take back the deposit, they put it back to market, the market value is less, they go back to the original purchaser and say, you're on the hook for, say, $400,000 because that's how much the market value shifted. And there's precedent through the courts that they will get paid. So you want to be very careful and make sure when you're operating, you have a good fundamental understanding of what are the risks involved and how do you mitigate them.
Andrew, let's role play, okay? And let's apply some of these approaches that you've described. So I'm trying to sell my house.
Okay.
So what should I be working with my real estate agent on? Okay,
so we're on the market. We know it's going to be a slower market. We're patient. We've now had a buyer come to the table. We want to make sure that the deal is going to close. So when we're working, negotiating with the party on the other side, we want to have an understanding of, are you a cash deal? Do you require financing? Do you have a backup property you have to sell? Okay, you have a backup property you have to sell. If that's going to be existential to the deal completing, then we're going to think in terms of structuring the deal in such a way that the parties have the ability to get everything completed to get over the finish line.
Okay.
As a purchaser, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to buy this home, I have to sell mine. So I need that condition for the sale of purchaser's property. So, because I got to get my home sold. On the selling side, you may say, okay, I'm all right with you having that condition, but I want to be able to still offer my property up for sale to other potential purchasers. So then we would put in what's called an escape clause. So you've now got a deal where you've got purchaser number one has put an offer on your property. You're still on the market. 25 days go by. Purchaser number two comes forward and says, hey, I'll give you an offer for your property. You're saying, okay, I like your offer, I like your terms, but the first guy has an option. I'm going to go back to him, and you've contracted through the deal and say, you've got 48 hours. You can either firm up and you're going to buy my property, or I'm going to activate the escape clause. I'm going to push you out of the way, and I'm going to work with buyer number two.
I like this because it feels fair.
Yeah.
Because as a buyer, you put on the conditional offer to protect yourself. But, that puts the seller in an uncomfortable position. Maybe the deal falls through.
Yeah.
but by allowing them to accept subsequent offers afterwards,
Yeah,
there's
more
a sweetener.
flexibility.
There's a sweetener to
Yeah.
it, in a sense. But I'm sure not everybody writes in that part of it. They just go, okay, it's okay that it's conditional on the sale of your house, and then they're locked into that.
And this is where the value of experience in structuring becomes really important. You want to make sure that you have a firm understanding of all the different variables, all the different approaches that you can use on both sides of the table, because you all want to make sure that you're going to get either to the finish line or you're going to have a safe and clean exit if this isn't going to go forward. The biggest thing we want to avoid is we don't want to breach a deal. You don't want to get to the closing date and suddenly somebody can't close. Either the buyer can't close or the seller can't close.
Yes.
Because the end result of that is a lawsuit. And that's, at the end of the day, the most important thing we want to avoid.
So let me be the buyer in this situation. So we've outlined some of the clauses, but I need a mortgage.
Okay.
So what are some of the things with the mortgage? So I bought a house, I got to sell mine, and then you hear these like famous words of like, well, if there's a gap by a month or two, I'll just bridge it. No big deal. So talk to me about what bridging is.
Okay, so first up, so a bridge is literally what it sounds like. So you've made a purchase on a property, it's closing on like say you're closing December 1st. You are now selling your property and you have a buyer for your property, but they say, I can't close until December 15th. So you got a 2-week window where you need to close your new property that you want to move into and get yourself moved in with your family, but you haven't had your house deal closed behind you yet. So you need the funding to move to close that first deal while you're waiting for your backup property to close, which will be in a couple of weeks later. So literally the bridge is an extension of funds to get that done. That's the bridge. It's literally just bridging your equity before it ports from the previous property to the new property.
So, but importantly, you said your old house needs to close.
Yes.
Meaning you've got a deal, signed deal. This isn't, I'll sell it later and the bridge will just last into perpetuity for me.
No. Yeah.
So you need...
Yeah, it's a definite period of time, and it's contingent on that deal closing. There is closing insurance, believe it or not, which we haven't had to think about for years, but these are some of the products that are out there in the market for these types of situations. When market conditions change, you can insulate yourself as a purchaser. So it's really important that you're getting good advice, because there are a lot of tools that are out there that can make sure things are going to work and go smoothly. You just want to make sure you know what they are and that they're being presented to you.
Perfect. So, I mean, the market is still moving. People are buying houses. They're selling houses. But I think if I can summarize our conversation today, it's if you're selling a home or a condo or whatever it may be patient.
Be patient.
And
if you're buying a home, you should
be patient.
Be patient. Be patient.
Well, you should be patient with each other.
Yeah.
Because things have slowed down.
Yeah.
And you're not just buying a home after looking at it for 20 minutes.
Yeah. And
things are different.
Yeah, and you need to operate in today's market conditions. A lot of sellers, they have a tendency to look at what I would refer to as outlier values. You can't just look at what was in the past and say, I saw a house down the street, it sold for that dollar, mine must be worth that. A property is worth what somebody is willing to pay for it. And as market conditions change, the values of properties, they go up and they go down. They're only worth what someone's willing to pay for it on a given day. So you want to make sure that you've got current data, you're not looking in the past, and we always want to make sure we're keeping an eye in terms of forecasting, looking ahead. You just don't want to be mindful about what's happening in today's market right now, because that's the best indicator of value. And if you got fair value, then that usually says you should make a deal.
Amazing.
If you feel comfortable.
Amazing. Andrew, thank you so much for today. If anybody has any questions or they just want to go through some examples.
Reach out anytime. No cost, no obligation. We're always here. We're a resource for our clients to help them make guided decisions. We push out the information. We help them with the analysis for them to make the decisions that are best for them.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bryan. Good to see you.